Yeah.
You reckon Danny's fair dinkum about taking a screw out before he goes over the wall?
He's full of shit, mate.
I'll take care of this prick.
What are you doing, mate? Jesus, Ray.
Meet Ray Denning, brutal killer, serial armed robber, heartbreaker and prison escapologist. Tonight we examine the facts behind the fiction of Ray Denning, the Runner. Denning was a serial armed robber whose appalling conduct behind bars turned him into Australia's most notorious prisoner. No stranger to violence, Denning destroyed a prison guard's life with a hammer. He repeatedly tried to escape, committed armed robberies on the run, and became the only man in history to break out of one of the toughest prisons in Australia. Tonight, with dramatised scenes and expert analysis, we meet a man unable to escape the ghosts of his past, and we examine what motivated his terrible crimes.
Denning was basically a criminal protege. He was doing things at 18 that men in their 20s and 30s were barely thinking of doing.
I can't fucking wait.
He robbed banks because that's where the money was, and that was fair game for him.
Here's a man who knew the inside of some of the worst jails in the country. By the time he died, he spent almost 20 years in jail.
He escaped from Grafton, which was the prison that you couldn't escape from, and he ended up becoming quite a media celebrity.
When Ray Denning was 10 years old, he has seen his mother burn herself to death. And it's obviously had a huge impact on that boy and the man he became.
Denning's early years were marked by violence. Years later, he would tell his lawyer how his mother had suffered terrible abuse from his criminal father, ultimately taking her own life in the family home, with the children present to escape the violence.
Denning came from a very violent family. His father was a brutal, hard-nosed criminal who spent a lot of time in jail anyway, and as a consequence, he was left without a father as a guiding figure. More importantly, he was also a witness to his mother committing suicide in front of his eyes.
Basically, his mother committed suicide by immolation. It's a terrible thing for a 10-year-old child to have to witness.
And he was found trying to put his mother out. He was then, I think, transferred from relative to relative, had no stable upbringing.
It would have scarred him for life. He would have had images of his mother dying for many, many years. I suspect his mother's probably the only person in his life he probably truly loved. And for her to abandon him, which is the way he would have seen it, would have been very destructive.
After his mother's death, Denning drifted into a life of crime, graduating to armed robberies around his 18th birthday. Convicted at 21, he was sent to Parramatta Prison. Craig Cousins spent time in the same jail 20 years later, and even then, conditions were appalling.
It was an absolute hellhole. It was old, filthy, absolutely driven by the screws and their hatred of the maggots, as they used to refer to the prisoners there. Very, very violent. No facilities for education, no library, really just about nothing to do. And so it's any wonder that there was so much overt violence in that prison. And it was never controlled in any way by the prison officers, other than them pointing guns at you from their towers at muster.
Just 18 months into his sentence, Denning made his first serious escape attempt, committing the crime which would haunt him forever. The brutality shocked even seasoned crime reporters.
The assault on Willie Faber, as well as being outrageously violent, was completely unnecessary in the context of Denning and his fellow inmates' attempt to escape.
You reckon Denny's fair dinkum about taking a screw up before he goes over the wall?
He's full of shit, mate.
The three other inmates that Denning had intended escaping with, I think, would have been surprised and appalled at Denning's reaction that day.
Screw!
I don't think anyone else envisaged bashing someone half to death to get out of jail.
I'll take care of this prick.
What are you doing, mate? Jesus, Ray.
Willie Faber was the prison officer who he took to, and he repeatedly bashed him over the head.
Mate, get off him!
Past insensibility, far past insensibility. And the fact of the matter is that Willie Faber lived for another 4 sick, terrible years. It may have done someone good, but I don't think it was Willie Faber or those around him. It was a terrible beating.
Denning couldn't be charged with murder over bashing Faber, but there's no doubt in anyone's mind that Denning was certainly responsible for the death in the long term.
Willie Faber died of his injuries 4 years after the attack, and Denning received a life sentence. However, Denning always maintained his innocence, claiming he had been convicted on evidence falsified by corrupt police, otherwise known as being verbal.
That's the only charge he ever denied. And he was charged with many offences, many armed robberies over a 10, 20-year period.
He had always maintained that he had been found guilty on an unsworn statement and that he'd been verbaled.
Denning's senseless and unbelievably violent attack inevitably raised questions about motivation.
Very often where you come across an antisocial personality and a rejection of authority figures and the law and prison officers, etc., it does come back to something to do with the male role models early in life.
Any male model he has had in his life has been dysfunctional, both from his father's dysfunctional male model, the criminals that he hangs around with the male models, and then he gets confronted with the boundaries and due process in prison.
It may well be that there's some legacy there. It may be that it's I'm going to get you as a representative of the system. It might be that he wants to just hurt somebody.
Denning was born in 1951 in Port Kembla near Wollongong and suffered an exceptionally hard and brutal childhood. His father, Jack, was in and out of prison, and his mother struggled to earn enough to bring up Ray and his sister, Charmaine, by herself. Denning would later tell his lawyer of his father's terrible violence towards the family. It was a desperate situation, and the children were raised in fear.
Ray told me, and certainly his view was there, that his father was a violent person who'd been in jail for armed robbery as well. There was no relationship between father and son. He was a very, very violent person, had beaten both Ray and his mother.
Denning's father was a criminal, Jack the Hat. Jack was away from the family home for most of the short time that Ray spent there before the death of his mother. He was a criminal, in and out of jail, and it would appear that no one in the family particularly wanted to have much to do with him.
Experts now understand the devastating impact long-term abuse can have on both women and children, with the victims at a higher risk of post-traumatic stress disorder and suicide. Tragically, Denning's mother didn't get the help she so desperately needed and resorted to drastic action to end her suffering.
There's certainly a strong suggestion that Ray Denning's father's release from prison and his return to the family home may have caused Ray's mother's suicide.
Now, it was supposed at the time that she was just so thoroughly exhausted by the brutal life she lived with her husband, and the thought of him coming back home again after jail was just too much.
What he said was that the father was being released from jail, the mother, rather than face up to her then husband, she set herself on fire, and Ray saw it occur, and there's no doubt that had a major impact on his attitude towards his father, certainly, but I think generally as well.
At just 10 years old, Ray witnessed his mother's death in the family home. Some viewers may find the following scene distressing.
He won't be here until tomorrow.
It will be better this time.
I hope you're right, but don't think you are.
It will be better, Ma.
Don't get your hopes up, Raymond. Your father's been gone a long time.
He promised to take me to the footy every weekend.
Why don't you go and play outside, son?
Denning was haunted by his mother's death for years. Nearly 2 decades later, writing in prison, he was still trying to process what he'd witnessed.
It was a cold, windy night when Mother lost a fight and set herself alight. It was a self-slaughter to try and save a son and daughter.
The effect on any individual of witnessing a member of their close family die in an unnatural fashion can leave an imprint, and depending upon the circumstances, it can affect them for the rest of their lives.
It's hard to imagine a 10-year-old witnessing a scene like that. And it's obviously had a huge impact on that boy and the man he became.
He's never going to be able to resolve the grief or the anger that he will feel at being abandoned, because there'll not only be sadness, but there'll be anger. He's lost everything.
Mom!
And in some ways, when the mother kills herself, that's a rejection of him, as well as a dying of herself. It's a rejection of him.
Mom?
It's a terrible thing for a 10-year-old child to have to witness, and one suspects that his cards were marked from that point on as a criminal.
With their mother dead, Ray and Charmaine were separated, and Ray was sent to live with relatives.
Within months of the death of his mother, Ray has run away from the home of the relatives with whom he was staying. He returned, stayed a brief period, and then ran away for good. For the rest of his childhood and his teenage years, he's in and out of children's courts and juvenile homes. By the time he's 18, he's appeared in courts in 4 states.
It seems that without parenting figures and without anyone who actually loved him, he fell in with whoever would welcome him, and that was a criminal element. He didn't pay much attention to the law. No one had really drilled those values into him, and so when armed robberies and other things came up, I'd imagine it was at least the sense of adventure or camaraderie that appealed to him as much as anything else.
Experts believe the extreme violence which characterised Denning's crimes can be directly traced back to the terrible events of his childhood.
It really is, the template has already been set. The template was set virtually by being born into that dysregulated family, and the template was then reinforced again by the trauma of his mother. The template was then again reinforced because he had no one to look after him afterwards. So there's obviously very much a developmental trajectory, and it's not surprising at all that he sought solace in crime.
It's not uncommon for criminals who lose their parents young, to suicide or violence, to feel that it's every man for himself. And Ray Denning in his early period certainly thought it was every man for himself.
So the violence and the armed robberies is an attempt to try and manage the internal rage and the disconnectedness that he would be feeling.
After his mother's tragic suicide in 1961, Denning was sent to live with relatives but repeatedly ran away and was fending for himself from the age of just 13. Denning lived on the streets and spent time in New South Wales' brutal and dehumanising boys' home system, places he would later describe as worse than prison.
The boys' home system only breeds criminals. Most boys' homes I've been in are worse than jails. Albion Street Boys Shelter, Minder, Gosford Boys Homes, etc., etc. There's just some I know, and they're worse than jails, because I've been in all of them.
When he left home, he would have had no alternative but to move to the streets. He had been homeless, he'd had to steal to feed, he'd mixed with children in similar circumstances. There were attempts to make him wards of the state, but wards of the state in those days would have been simply just housed, and a lot of those children suffered from being institutionalised. The system simply wasn't geared or funded, resourced in a way that the children felt supported. So he'd have been in and out of foster homes, care homes, and eventually he would have found his own way in the street.
So he was free-floating, effectively, in the streets. So naturally he's going to gravitate to older criminals because it's easy, it's teachable. He didn't have school environment, there was no supervision, which today would be just almost unheard of, to have a 13-year-old have no supervision coming from a family like that.
He's already grown up in an under-socialised way. He's already got parental models that demonstrate a lack of any kind of moral restraint, and then when his mother kills herself in the way that she does, it's a dramatic and terrible act. I mean, this is a guy who's used to dramatic and terrible acts and not being able to feel about them. So there's just nothing in the system that would prevent him, that would hold him back once he starts on the chain.
Homeless as a teenager, Denning got involved in a life of crime, quickly racking up a substantial juvenile record.
His offending CV includes stealing, goods in custody, traffic offences from dangerous driving, driving without a licence, car theft, break-in and steal, malicious injury, resisting arrest, using indecent language, vagrancy, possessing an unlicensed pistol, false pretences, assault police, armed robbery, malicious damage, escape lawful custody.
Alone on the streets, Ray drifted towards older criminals who took him under their wing. While other kids his age were graduating from high school, Ray was committing armed robberies and discovering the power a gun could bring.
Got the car.
Where'd you leave it?
Ryde railway station, like you told me.
What'd you get?
Valiant, dark green.
Not going to break down outside the bank, is it?
I looked under the bonnet. Engine's in tip-top shape. Took it for a spin, mate. Goes like hot shit.
That one's not yours. This is for you. You know where the safety is?
Yeah.
Just here, yeah? Make sure it's on except for when you need it to be off. I said make sure it's on. All right. We get to the bank. We pull up outside. I go in first. You wait 20 seconds. Not 10, not 30. Count them in your head. 1,000, 2,000, 20 seconds. Then you go in. The minute you go in, I want you to wave the shotty around. Don't say a word. Just point the fucking thing at whoever moves.
Right, yeah. Crowd control. I got it.
Right. Now, there might be some civic-minded idiot in the group who wants to be a hero. What do you do?
Blow his head off?
Don't fuck around. This is serious. A good look down the barrel of the shotty is enough to put most of them off. But if they still want to have a go, crack them across the head with the butt of the gun or give them a swift kick in the gut. Then move away.
Right, gotcha.
I'll be over the jump, grabbing the cash. So you watch the staff. Make sure none of them does anything stupid like reaching for the alarm.
Right. Okay.
Listen, son. I don't do this to kill people. We just want the cash, okay?
All right.
Good. I'm going to grab a tub, then we'll get going. Make sure you're ready.
Mate, I can't fucking wait.
He robbed banks because that's where the money was. And that was fair game for him. He understood that's where money was, that's where you'd go and get it. But he had this respect for the family home. He said to me at one point, I never did homes. He wouldn't invade someone's living space and rob from them. Banks, however, were fair game.
For Denning, an angry young man who'd been powerless all his life, the sensation of being in control must have been intoxicating.
It's a dominion and control over the people's lives at the spur of the moment or as a planned way of behaviour. Very callous in a lot of ways. You've got no idea the suffering of some of the people that have been held up by these guys and they've never got over it.
You do an armed robbery and you get 10 grand, And you do one, you get 20 grand, you do one, you get 30 grand, well, then it goes to your head, doesn't it? You keep making more money and more money and more money and getting away with more stuff, more stuff, more stuff. And you start getting you bite off bigger targets.
Denning was caught in 1972 and sent to Parramatta Prison for armed robbery. Here, he made the infamous escape attempt, which cost guard Willie Faber his life. Denning received a life sentence and was reclassified as an intractable or highly dangerous prisoner and sent to a new maximum security jail at Katingal. Here he served time alongside fellow armed robber Russell Cox. Nicknamed the Electronic Zoo, the lack of natural light and human contact drove many prisoners insane.
He'd been through about the worst the New South Wales prison system had to offer. He was in Katingal for a while where he described that as a very inhuman experience, and Katingal had a method by which it was not just solitary confinement, but where even your meals would be given to you on a mechanised plate. You would have no contact even with your prison warders. He ended up giving evidence to the Nagle Royal Commission about that, and there weren't that many witnesses available because so many of them had gone insane in Katingal.
After a Royal Commission closed Katingal, Denning was sent to Maitland, another maximum security prison. There, it was only a few weeks before he made another escape attempt.
Regardless of what prison anybody's in, I can assure you there's always that hankering to be out. You know, it's not always the best career move, but people don't like being incarcerated. It's human nature, and so of course there's always plans afoot. Left, right and centre, there's always someone scheming something.
In 1977, Denning and 6 others, all armed robbers, escaped from Maitland Jail, a maximum security prison, going out through the roof of a new shower block in the prison, down over the wall, and then off into the suburbs and countryside. While it was some feat to get out of that jail, which is effectively a big stone box, not much thought had gone into what they were going to do once they got over the wall.
The escape attempt ultimately failed, and all the prisoners were rounded up within 4 hours. Denning was rapidly becoming a problem for the Department of Corrections. With 2 serious escape attempts and a history of violence, there was only one prison left which would take him. A place so brutal it has been called the Australian Alcatraz. Denning was off to Grafton.
Grafton Jail existed as a place of last resort punishment. If you mucked up in another New South Wales prison, you were shanghaied to Grafton. Most people didn't go back a second time.
And in Grafton, the prison officers were trained, highly skilled at metering punishment, and that was their job and they loved it.
He and anybody else who went through Grafton Jail as a prisoner were subject to routine bashings, assaults by prison guards. It was really an 18th century type prison environment.
Just when Denning would have thought life couldn't get any more awful, Willie Faber, the guard he had attacked 4 years previously while trying to escape from Parramatta, died of his injuries. Denning's already grim existence was about to get a whole lot worse.
For someone who had bashed a prison officer, to the extent that Denning had, Grafton would have held even more than its usual fears. He would have been flogged senseless on arrival and probably flogged every day for months.
He was bashed regularly on his account by prison officers. He said he was threatened with death and he believed those threats.
It was here that Ray began documenting his experiences.
The longer I'm kept in jail, the more antisocial I'm becoming. I came into jail with feelings of love, kindness, sympathy, emotion and understanding, but now I know the only way I can survive is to live on revenge, hate and violence. This is the only avenue left to prisoners to take.
Grafton's barbarity finally gave Denning something worthwhile to fight for, and he started working with the prison reform movement, who were campaigning against police verbals and for better conditions for prisoners. He kept a diary documenting the daily beatings and abuses, which were smuggled out of prison and published, causing a storm. Former politician Meredith Bergman was just one of the big names who supported the campaign.
Well, it was the late 70s and a number of sort of lawyers and activists were getting involved in prison reform as an issue because the prisons were just dreadful places. They were violent and very unlawful.
Denning began publicly campaigning for Grafton's closure, trying to expose what really was barbarity going on inside those walls.
Ray was very interesting because he claimed to have been imprisoned for a fabricated confession, and we were running a campaign against police verbals at the time, which many, particularly men, were ending up in jail with these unsigned confessions.
Denning gave the first, as far as I know, the first accurate descriptions of what went on inside a lot of the grimmer prisons in New South Wales. And so he was sort of kind of placed in a position where he could blow that apart, and he did.
But Ray Denning was never going to be satisfied just with words. He may have been incarcerated in a prison no one had escaped from, but that wasn't going to stop him trying.
Yeah, well, fucking blowfly thinks I'm alive.
Shit, what happened to you, mate? They get you again, did they?
Worse than yesterday. They're going to kill me if I don't put a stop to this. I am sick of this shit.
Mate, the papers are never going to run a story about violence against criminals.
Fucking oath they will.
Yeah? Mr. and Mrs. Squarehead out there reckon we're all in here for a reason and we deserve whatever we get.
That is bullshit. Because there's votes in this. If we can get it out to the public that this place is run by these thugs, the police will have to do something. It's supposed to be about rehabilitation in here.
He's got a point.
It's got to get the message out.
Why don't you tell him your idea then?
What idea?
About getting out. If we get him out, it might just work for all of us.
What do you got? What is it?
Rubbish detail.
What about it?
Every day we take the skip out the gates to the incinerator. There's no screws.
They check the skips.
We put a cardboard box in there. We create a diversion. You hop in the skip, get in the box, and cover you with rubbish. As soon as you hear the front gates close behind you, you get out of there as quick as you can.
Run like hell. You got a cardboard box, I'm ready to go tomorrow. We'll be on the papers within a week.
Late last night, the ABC's rock station 2JJ was given a tape recording purporting to have been made by Raymond Denning a few days ago. Raymond Denning, you may remember, escaped from Grafton jail over a fortnight ago.
While on the run, Denning continued to campaign for prison reform. Meredith Bergman, a politician involved in the Prisoners' Action Group of the 1970s, helps recreate one of their meetings based on real events.
He left his handprint on the front door of the police station. The police must be furious.
Fancy having to deal with his mother committing suicide like that in those conditions in prison.
Yes. I wonder why the police can't find him, given that he's so public.
Well, he can stop by my place anytime he likes.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? You have here today Ray Denning, the only man to ever escape from Grafton jail. Now, what we've heard from Ray and the Prisoners' Action Group at Grafton has shocked and horrified us all. And in the wake of those appalling stories, we have no choice but to call for the immediate closure of Grafton jail.
He looks so sad.
Now, Ray is a reluctant hero, and given what he's been through, the bashings, the verballing, the perjurers, it's amazing he's here at all. He doesn't want to speak, but he has asked me to play his latest tape for you all today. So thank you very much, Ray.
This is Raymond John Denning here. I've made a certain amount of demands concerning my return back to jail following my escape from Grafton.
He escaped from Grafton, which was the prison considered to be, you know, that you couldn't escape from. And he'd also done it in quite a sort of romantic way, I suppose, in that he'd hidden in a garbage bin that was considered pretty interesting. And he ended up becoming quite a media celebrity.
Raymond John Denning has been one of Australia's most notorious jailbirds. The outspoken prison activist who published his own prison diary attracted wide publicity when he made a video to air his grievances about the prison system while on the run. He even left a note on the wall of the Sydney CIB.
He was considered a bit cool, and because the prisons were so terrible, there was a lot of support for someone who had broken out.
It's one thing to have a 60 Minutes reporter say the jails are corrupt, full of people beating prisoners up. It's another to have an articulate prisoner who's in jail saying, I have been beaten up, I am part of the system, they have made it worse for me and people like me. It makes it more immediate.
Just because you come to jail shouldn't mean that you've got to be treated like garbage or treated like an animal.
He wanted to go on the record totally with the verbals and forged confessions from police and how prisoners were being railroaded inside prisons into long sentences, how they had no real rights in prison and how they were brutalised while they were in there.
His view was there that the prison system was intolerable. He was a victim of beatings, continual beatings, and he took the view that he'd like to publicise that. And I think he also enjoyed the notoriety which he got because of it. Things like shooting up Parramatta Jail, which he was never convicted of, but in effect was admitted to doing it.
There was one marvellous occasion where he put a letter, taped a letter to the front door of the police headquarters, the glass doors, and then left his palm print there just so that they really knew it was Ray Denning.
And the public lapped it all up, and so suddenly we had a man who was on the run as an escaped criminal lecturing us all on the things that were wrong with the prison system.
At least 99% of the prisoners in jail at the moment, they're not looking for any sympathy at all. All they're looking for is what is known as a bit of equality.
With his boyish good looks and tragic life story, Denning's campaign for prison reform caused a media storm and turned the killer into an anti-hero heartthrob. But Denning wasn't as innocent as he seemed. On the run, he committed armed robberies and amassed a vast cache of weapons. The public support for Denning was extremely frustrating for police trying to bring him in.
I've always used the term with these activists who supported Denning that they were that far to the left that you just couldn't hear the band playing, and they just supported him. Anything that was anti-establishment, and they tried to promote him as some sort of an oppressed folk hero, the product of the system, whereas he was in jail because of what he did. Now, he was an adult. He committed serious crime, and then he continued to commit serious crime. So it's just a nonsense to blame the system for an adult who goes on a rampage and effectively bashes a prison officer to death.
I couldn't give a shit about prison reform. I couldn't give a rat's ass about prison reform, and I've got no time for people that want to go on about prison reform. Better food or better conditions or stop bashing us and all the rest of it. If you want the screws to stop bashing you, you go and speak to them yourself. You don't go waving placards and say stop bashing me, you go and tell them to stop bashing you, you know? And if you want better food, you go up to them and say, listen, you serve me better food or I'll fucking cut your throat, you know? And I had good food, you know?
In 1981, Denning was recaptured after 20 months on the run. At his trial in 1983, he received a 10-year sentence for escaping from Grafton. However, just 1 month later, the trial judge mysteriously revoked his sentence. Speculation was rife that Denning had struck some kind of a deal. Was the hero of the prisoners' rights movement finally starting to cross to the other side?
Strangely enough, while he's in prison for that 5-year period, there's no complaints about how he's treated. There's no complaints about his mail being open. There's no complaints about how he's, managed by the prison system. So it seems for that 5-year period, he seems to have had a reasonably comfortable, undisturbed, settled time with the promise that when you get out, you might have a window of opportunity to settle down.
The change in Denning did seem genuine, and he eventually ended up on a low-security wing at Goulburn Prison. But old habits die hard, and in 1988, Denning hopped over the fence and escaped again. He was joined by new girlfriend, mother of 3, Anne Denton, who'd fallen in love after writing to him in prison. Denton left her 3 children behind and went on the run with Denning. Together they joined his fellow armed robber, Russell Cox, who was still in hiding after escaping from Katingal 11 years earlier.
Russell Cox found him and took him under his wing and helped him and gave him money and a place to stay and looked after him. And Russell Cox mothered him like an old mother hen.
Amazingly, Cox had been on the run for 11 years. For more than a decade, the police couldn't find him. Denning found him in a week. Maybe he should have joined the force.
On the run in Melbourne, Denning and Cox quickly drew attention to themselves following an armoured van through the city. Guards rang police, but by the time they arrived, the men had gone into a shop. Former robbery squad detective Paul Mullett searched the car. Realising who he was dealing with, he called for backup.
Knowing that Denning was in the vehicle, we decided to take that vehicle head on. We intercepted Denning very quickly. He was subdued, thrown from the driver's side of the car straight into the bitumen, knowing his potential for violence. So he was arrested very quickly, very efficiently, and a sawn-off 22 was secured in his vehicle.
And after a struggle, Russell Cox was also recaptured. Australia's two most wanted men were now back in custody.
Denning surrendered very easily at the time, giving further evidence that perhaps he'd had enough and that he was worn out by the constant jail life, by the pressure of escaping and trying to keep free.
Anne Denton was placed on a 3-year good behaviour bond and swore to stand by her man.
Going to be in jail for another 30 years. I'll wait for him.
Why?
Because I love him and I know he's not what everyone thinks he is.
After many hard years in prison and on the run, Denning was spent. He was also frightened by the prospect of serving a life sentence in Victoria. Within weeks of his arrest, Denning had made the momentous decision to do a deal with police and turn supergrass.
You got to get me out of Joker, Mr. Butts. The only guy I know in here is Russell Cox. He scares the shit out of me.
Well, we can transfer you to New South Wales, right? But you got to give us something we can work with. You got to throw us a bone.
I just got to know that we're the only ones here.
We're in the Women's Remand Centre, Ray. We've cleared the whole joint out. There's just you, me, and Detective Sergeant Jones. There's no one else in the whole building.
I just can't have this one getting out.
You'll be right. No one knows you're here. But it begs the question, Ray. Why are you doing this?
I've had a gutful. The bashings, the guns, sleeping every single night with one eye open. I just got to make a fresh start.
Fair enough. So what do you got?
You know that armed robbery in Brunswick?
Which one? When?
Young security guard got shot, killed.
Dominic Hefty.
That's the one. I know the shooter.
You got a name, Ray?
Sano Mercury.
There were 3 others there. Do you know who they were?
Ray took the view and said on a number of occasions that had he not changed, he would spend the rest of his life in jail, and he didn't want that. He was, at that stage, still a young man, and he wanted out, and he saw that as being the way to get out. And in fact, we used that as one of the bases to put the application on to get his life sentence determined.
He wouldn't have been happy going back. And when they started adding up the robberies in Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, and he was told he'd have a prospect of another 15 years jail, I suspect he would have done anything at all to keep out of jail.
Peter Butts spent several long days interrogating Denning, and he too sensed Denning was worn out.
My first question to Denning was, on video, we've had a long day together, you've told us a lot of information about a lot of crimes, why have you done this? And he spoke about things on the line of, you know, I've spent all my life in jail. After so long, I've realised it's probably
not the way I want to spend the rest of my life. If I've spent half it in jail, I wouldn't mind spending the other half as a free man.
Denning's decision to turn supergrass shocked everyone. To this day, people still struggle to understand his decision.
Yes, when we heard that Ray Denning had turned informer, I remember talking to some of the guys from the Prisoners Action Group. I was still friends with them, and I remember them saying, "Gosh, if Denning can turn, anyone can." People were pretty shocked.
He really should have known better, because he did run with a lot of heavyweight guys, and he did a lot of heavyweight things, and to roll over like that, it's just despicable. And it's an act of a dog, and that's what he did, mate. He did that, and he should have known better.
No one expected Denning to turn dog. Ray Denning turned dog. Unbelievable. Loathsome maggots and turds, you know, like prison yard snitches. I don't like them at all, you know, just loathsome maggots and turds, you know.
Although Denning's decision to turn informer was highly controversial, forensic psychologist Chris Lennings has some insight into his motivation.
It's a survival strategy. It's a way of being able to fight the system without getting yourself kicked all the time. And I would imagine that he's very hooked into survival. And what he does now is part and parcel of that survival strategy. This is another way for him to survive, because he doesn't have any loyalties. He would never be able to establish loyalties. He would be a person who, from a very early age, would have learnt that the only person you can trust is yourself.
In 1993, Ray Denning was finally about to be released a free man, having turned a sentence for armed robbery in 1973 into a 20-year marathon of prison and life on the run. After having turned supergrass, Denning was hoping to start a new life in witness protection, but instead found himself at the centre of a political storm.
There was political pressure about him being on the witness protection program, which costs a lot of money, and there was some flack going around that state government money and the taxpayers' money was being used to protect this criminal, in response to which they dropped him from the program, just about as he was being released.
A lot of published in the media, a lot of the radio people were very much opposed to it. The politicians reacted, and indeed one of the police who'd done a report saying that he should be released into the witness protection program, then another review which said he shouldn't be.
So he was basically left to dry by the state government with no resources at all, and none of the identity protection that he'd been promised to save him from the underworld he'd informed on.
For a man whose attempts to get out of prison made so many headlines, the final release was decidedly low-key.
The Offenders Review Board on the 16th of April made a decision to allow Mr Denning out of prison.
After 2 decades in prison, Denning finally walked out a free man and moved in with yet another new girlfriend, Robin Lawson.
I think he had a number of girlfriends. He was living with one of those girlfriends. He had some other friends who he had a very close relationship with. He had some support from a psychologist. He seemed pretty set, or pretty happy in his setup at that stage.
If one suspects that he lost the plot when his mother died, then you have to presuppose that he actually loved his mum. There were a number of women in his life that had supported him. There was a woman with 3 kids in Ashfield. There was his girlfriend in Manly. I suspect that he had normal relationships with women.
With Robin's help, Denning tried to adjust to life on the outside. But over the years, he had made many enemies and must have worried that his days were numbered. In the end, he survived only 6 short weeks after his release, and his death came out of the blue.
This place is no better than prison.
Oh, try to relax, love. Why don't you try reading?
I'm going for a walk.
Well, do you think that's such a good idea? You've got every crim in Sydney after you. You shouldn't be walking around after dark.
Look, I'm just going to get a pie, all right? I'll be back in half an hour.
Be careful, love.
Yeah, righto. You might have waited here.
Suit yourself.
be half an hour.
Must have nodded off.
Oh, are you kidding? Where have you been?
It's all right, babe. I'm home now. Safe and sound.
Oh, that copper's coming round in a few hours. You coming to bed?
Nah, just gonna watch some telly. I'll be there soon. Just one more taste.
At 2:30 this morning, ambulance officers were called to a terrace house. They found Denning dead.
Ambulance officers attended and initial indications are that the man Denning collapsed. There are no suspicious circumstances.
Denning died on June the 11th, 1993. His lawyers were shocked at their client's sudden death and suspicious about the circumstances.
At the time he was found dead, we didn't know what to think. Those close to him were wondering whether he'd been poisoned.
I suppose we all had concerns that, in effect, he may have been killed to keep him quiet or for some other reason.
The problem was there wasn't any evidence. There were needle marks found in Ray, but in his back, nowhere where anyone would normally inject drugs. The coronial inquest that followed was a very tumultuous affair. I ended up seeing pictures of my client in various jars over a laboratory bench, which I found very confronting.
At the coroner's inquest, a shadowy informant dubbed Mr. Smith testified in return for immunity from prosecution. He admitted selling Denning heroin on the night he died. However, adding to the air of conspiracy building around Denning's death, police refused to allow him to be cross-examined. Was Denning being verballed in death, just as he'd verballed others in life?
The whole thing seemed to be rushed through, and I think in many ways it was almost seen as a relief that Ray was dead.
In the end, the coroner found that it was a self-administered heroin overdose.
My guess is it was foul play, whether directly or indirectly, whether it was a hot shot, whether somebody gave him that hot shot deliberately, we don't know.
I'm convinced in my mind that he was murdered. He was far too dangerous to other criminals based on the information he'd already provided and what else perhaps may have been going to come.
Although Denning may not have been a regular user, he wrote about enjoying drugs in his diary, and there is evidence he had previously overdosed.
When you're on drugs, you seem to see things in a clearer manner. That's the first thing that struck me, because people take life too seriously. And when you're on drugs, you can see the brighter side of things.
There is some information that suggests that he was using heroin in 1980, 1981. He had an overdose with a friend at the time. He was using amphetamines when he couldn't get heroin.
To most people, they didn't even know Ray Denning used heroin. Most people thought he was one of those hard blokes, but, you know, in the end, he was a junkie and he told on people.
The suggestion that Ray Denning was a complete stranger to drugs is complete tosh. He was a broken, pathetic man using heroin. Whether he intended to overdose or not, I can't say, but if you're injecting heroin, you're taking that risk.
Psychologists suggest he may have used heroin to mask the pain of his past.
Psychologically, he's an isolate. And that's why he started to use drugs in itself. I mean, heroin and most drugs, people call them recreational drugs or they're drug users or drug addicts, but it's actually, the function of drugs is to mask emotions.
Don't forget, this is a guy who's used to feeling emotionally numb, and that's one of the things that heroin will do for you. It'll make you feel quite numb. So to that extent, it's probably something that is useful and gives him some respite from some of the stuff that will be going through his head.
At the inquest into Denning's death, the coroner concluded he had died of a heroin overdose, but ruled out suicide. He had known just 6 weeks of freedom in 20 years and died aged 42.
How did I feel when I heard that Ray Denning had died? Not surprised. It was inevitable and sad because it was a
a life gone horribly wrong, but not in the slightest bit surprised.
Did he, in his solitude and madness and feeling total displacement, take to heroin to find some relief, or did a criminal he'd put away on bogus charges retaliate, as they always threatened to do? We'll never really know, but it was a sad and lonely end for a man who finished up unwanted by either side of society, the criminals or the police. So in the end, his poor misguided life came to an absolutely tragic end.
Denning had lived a violent and brutal life, haunted by memories of his mother's terrible suicide. He was a man of contradictions, a heartbreaker who loved women and a hero to many for his stand in Grafton, but someone who had no hesitation in violently bashing a prison guard or holding people up at gunpoint. Denning was a man who ran for years, from his past, from prison, from police, from one woman to another. Ultimately, he just ran out of time.